Okay, let's talk about what an ionic bond is. An ionic bond is a bond that is formed between a metal and a nonmetal atom. And what happens is the metal atom loses an electron and becomes a positive cation, and the nonmetal atom gains an electron and becomes a negative anion. And because you have a positive ion and a negative ion, they get attracted to each other. They have opposites attract, so we have a positive ion and a negative ion that gets close enough to each other, and then they attract and they form a very strong bond. That's called an ionic bond. The key words here are transfer of electrons. I'm trying to keep this short and sweet, so let's talk about some of the characteristics of an ionic bond. Because these bonds are really strong bonds, they tend to have very high melting points and very high boiling points compared to covalent compounds, which we'll talk about in another short video. They tend to be crystals, they tend to be solids, and salt is a prime example of an ionic, or a substance that is ionically bonded. It's a bond between a sodium, which we can see here, and a chlorine. What happens is the sodium atom loses this one valence electron, and that valence electron gets transferred over to the chlorine, and when that happens, the sodium becomes a naked atom, which is called an ion, and it's positively charged, and the chlorine becomes a negatively charged anion, and then they have an attraction. And this is a very strong attraction. And when they are attracted to each other, they're locked into place, so they can't move around. But what happens sometimes is they get wet, and when they get wet, the positive ion and the negative ion are free to move around. When those ions are free to move around, they can conduct electrical current. This only happens when the ions are free to move around, and that's why we see here it says conduct electric current in molten solution state but not in the solid. So ionic compounds are very particular in when they can conduct electricity. They can only conduct electricity when their ions are free to move around, and that will only happen when the ions, when the bond is broken apart by adding water to it and letting the ions flow through the water. And you also see here that these bonds are very polar. And polar bonds mean that they're not sharing those electrons equally, and it's quite obvious that they're not sharing them equally because the sodium loses its electron, and that electron goes over to chlorine. Alright, in this little slide we can see that ionic bonds are formed in 3 steps. And what I would like to do is I would like to show you those 3 steps with me drawing them on the smartboard. So hold on one second and I will be right back. Okay, here we have a sodium atom. Maybe we have a sodium atom? Smartboard? There you go. And that sodium atom has 1 valence electron. We'll mark that as a valence electron. And then we have chlorine over here, and chlorine has 7 valence electrons. So this guy has 7 and this guy has 1. And what will happen is that electron from the sodium will move and will go over to the chlorine. When it does that, the sodium becomes positively charged. And we put it in those little brackets so that you can see that there's no electrons there. There's no electrons here around the sodium. And then the chlorine, which just gained that electron, right there, becomes negatively charged. And what will happen is this chlorine will get attracted to that sodium. And right here is the ionic bond.